Hey everybody, welcome to the latest episode of Cannabis Unlocked with Key Investment Partners. I'm Pete Karabas, one of the founding partners over at Key, and today we have Mara Sheldon with us. Mara is a principal at Squire Patton Boggs and is an expert on the regulatory landscape, certainly within cannabis. As well as in other facets of the government. She works with Governor Polis out in Colorado and is one of the top advisors we look to when we want the latest with everything related to the cannabis regulatory environment. So Mara, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pete. Really happy to be here. I appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. So it's great to have you on. I know we had you on, I want to say it was a couple months ago or so. But at that time, right, in front of us, we had safe banking. Everybody in cannabis was all safe banking, what's going to happen? At the end there, it felt like we were going to get it passed. And then in December, there was a little maneuvering, ultimately got stopped by McConnell. A lot of opinions going around as to how that happened. It was, I'd say, a big letdown for the industry, but nonetheless, onwards we go in the cannabis space. And I guess one thing I would ask when we talk to investors and portfolio companies that people I think are very curious about is, okay, how did SAFE not pass? And now that it has not passed, we obviously have a new Congress in session, and what does 2023 really look like going forward?
Well, I will tell you, I don't think SAFE is off the table just yet. There's definitely been a lot going on behind closed doors on how to proceed with SAFE. But I think that if we look at another SAFE bill, that it would definitely need to include what was possibly coming last session. We had heard some whispers about expungements, about Second Amendment rights. So it wouldn't be the safe banking bill that had passed now 7 times in the House and has not seen any kind of votes yet in the Senate. But what that was being talked about was being called Safe Plus. So I think that is what we would be looking at for the next go around. We just saw the first Senate committee markup and advancement on a cannabis bill take place on February 16th when the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, it held a hearing to advance VA medicinal cannabis research. It's a bipartisan bill. It directs the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to carry out a study and clinical trials on the effects of cannabis for veterans suffering from chronic pain and PTSD. So we're starting to see a few of these very interesting veteran-focused cannabis bills emerging in both the House and Senate. The Senate bill is sponsored, it's a bipartisan bill, as I mentioned, sponsored by Senators Tester from Montana and Sullivan from Alaska, And, additionally, the administration is working on what scheduling looks like for cannabis as well. And that's an announcement I think that we're all really eager to hear.
Oh, yeah, no question. And that's what I've been loosely talking to various different people within the industry and outside of the industry is, perhaps rescheduling is next now. I mean, obviously, we had the medical research bill passed. Biden asked the Attorney General to take another look right at the scheduling of cannabis, rescheduling of cannabis. So, you're jumping ahead even in my questions, but what I would say is, no, that's totally fine. Is what does that look like? That's the next question, we hear all the time is, okay, cannabis gets rescheduled. How does that unfold, specifically in your opinion, or what different paths could it maybe take?
Well, before I answer that, I will also share with you and anyone who's listening to the podcast that a new study was just released by the Coalition of Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation. And it found that 68% of likely Republican voters support ending federal cannabis prohibition. So that number has actually gone up 10 points from a similar poll that this exact group did a year ago. And the poll was really being touted by a bunch of Republican members of the House. It was touted on social media from Nancy Mace, who's from South Carolina, Brian Mast from Florida, and David Joyce from Ohio. And Mast and Joyce are both co-chairs of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. So there is definitely a lot of bipartisan support and probably a little bit more Republican support, I think, than most people really know that's out there. So really wanted to make sure to highlight that, because the fact that this is such a bipartisan issue. But jumping forward to the answer to your question, we have a different dynamic in Congress this session with a Republican House majority and a Democratic Senate majority. So, if we look at safe banking, it's going to need to start in the Senate this time. It's, as I mentioned, hasn't been voted in that chamber, and the Republican-led House is certainly less likely to pick the bill up this session, frankly, because Speaker McCarthy, who also, by the way, has voted previously for safe banking, has said that he's really not likely to bring bills to the floor unless he's got a majority of what the majority would vote for. That said, not sure where his majority is, but because it's such a slim majority, I think that it is less likely that the House would bring it up. But I would never say never on that.
Sure.
And as I mentioned, there has been such overwhelming bipartisan support. A lot of the Republican leadership too in the House has said, they don't support safe banking, but they're not going to stand in the way if the bill does come to the floor. But obviously that would be certainly controlled, by the majority. So, it's also a bill I think that the president would sign. So I wouldn't discount it completely, as I've mentioned, in the House, but it really does need to start in the Senate. It does need that Senate vote first. And I think that that's likely that when safe banking comes up again, that's where it'll start.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. That's interesting insights too. I guess even building on that a bit, Mara, and then I want to talk a little bit about the descheduling, but building on the safe banking item is, we get questions all the time from people learning about the industry, whether they want to invest, whether they're just learning, whether they're even portfolio companies. And there's this concept, it's bipartisan. I always say that it's a bipartisan effort. Both sides want it. People unfamiliar obviously think it's just this Democratic push, and it's not. But what do you really think got in the way? What really happened at the end of the year? What gummed up the train track, so to speak? You know what I mean? It felt like when you had Jeffries increase their expectation to 75% at the start of December, and they were conservative. All the whispers on Twitter, social media, you name it, getting more and more bullish, and it just felt like the wheels fell off the tracks, and it just kind of, it didn't happen. So, yeah.
And I think that what really happened was that we ran out of time. There was an issue of, as you mentioned, there's a lot of bipartisan support, but there were, when we hit the lame duck session, in November after the election, ultimately there were two very big bills that needed to pass by the end of the year: the National Defense Authorization Act and the appropriations bill. And so trying to get SAFE into one or both of those proved to be, I think, more challenging than anticipated. And ultimately, both sides have opportunity to weigh in heavily on that. And so at that point, when you're trying to get those types of bills that are must-pass bills done by the end of the year, ultimately, I think we just ran out of time, which is unfortunate. It really needs to go as a standalone bill, and it really needs to go just as usual order, which means it doesn't get tucked into another big must-pass type bill, because we saw the consequences of that.
Right. And I imagine with those bills too, they just get so complex, and you got to pick your priorities. And I guess cannabis just didn't make the list, and that's okay. As I've said to people, we're in this industry, we're used to getting beat up a little and waiting longer for things, and playing by a different set of rules. So onwards we go, I'd say. But to move on to then, so
Sure.
Back to my question, right, about descheduling, right? That's one thing I think people have talked about. I think the medical research bill is, of course, a means to research a plant formally that's really been growing in basements and whatnot and illegally for 80 years. So, now it's out in the sunlight, and we can put together data and talk to the proper government agencies and make some type of movement to reschedule or deschedule. What are your thoughts there? What does that look like? Is it a descheduling thing? Is it a rescheduling? Yeah, any thoughts on, I know this is probably hard, but where it could end up on the list schedule, 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera.
Sure. So I can tell you, the administration is definitely taking a thoughtful look at what data and science is out there. And recommendations, as you've mentioned already, will be coming from the Department of Justice, but also from HHS. And while the president says that he'd really like this to happen quickly, there isn't any specific time frame or deadline for when that decision is going to be made. And frankly, I'd like them to not really hurry on that. I'd love for them to and not take eternity, but certainly take a good amount of time with their internal process to make a well-informed decision based on facts and data. So that being said, and certainly 280, for the industry comes into play too here. So I don't see descheduling happening. I just don't, not with this administration. I do see rescheduling happening, and where cannabis would land, certainly is, the very big question that we all have. If cannabis stays at a 1 or a 2, 280E still exists. If it goes to a 3, 4, or 5, on the controlled substance list, that is certainly better for the industry. And it's certainly, we'd see the end of 280E. And, 280E is like a noose around the industry's neck. So, that being said, clearly the higher the number, a 4 or 5 would be more ideal for industry. And really, when you look at the controlled substance list, it's all really about abuse and addiction and where things fall. Cannabis, in my opinion, doesn't really fall in any of them, but it is not up to me to make that decision. So
I wish it were.
I know, thank you. Me too. That being said, as I mentioned, the administration is going to be, and they have already started taking a very thoughtful approach to research, data, statistics. There is not a lot out there, as you know. That's why a lot of these medicinal research bills and even rec bills on doing studies is so imperative, so that we have more fresh, new data to make compelling arguments and be able to point to and say, this is exactly why cannabis needs to be illegal. So,
and so that's what you mean, almost by take their time and do it the right way, right? Don't hastily change it to a Schedule 2 and put it on the back burner, whatever the bad scenario would be.
That wouldn't be helpful, right? So, I would say, the president definitely said he would really like this to be done expeditiously, but not so expeditiously, I'm sure, reading between the lines, that anything gets missed. So doing a really good, thoughtful process. I hope we'll see something in the next 6 months to a year on this. As I've mentioned, I know that they have been already doing lots of research on this. And, again, where cannabis will fall on the controlled substance list will be very interesting to see. I do hope that it is a 3, 4, or 5. And as mentioned, the higher the number, the better. And I can give you, some interesting examples. So, these known drugs on the controlled substance list that are, more well known. So, putting cannabis and heroin in the same sentence is like silly and ridiculous. So heroin's a Schedule 1, which cannabis is also. And then when you look at a Schedule 2, that would be Percocet or oxycodone. Again, to me, in my opinion, and again, not a physician or any kind of an expert, but those seem to definitely be more potent, in my opinion, than cannabis.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you there. I think even just reading news headlines for the past 10 years, I think you could probably draw a similar conclusion. And I think, of course, even people who don't support cannabis think it's would support that conclusion, right? So that's interesting.
Sure.
And let me ask you this too. So when I think about how they're going to decide this, okay, fast forward however many 6 to 9 months, they've done research, they have data, enough data that they feel is ample to make a certain decision about scheduling. Do you think, or to what extent do you think 280E has a influence on this, so to speak, right? So, you know, is obviously 280E brings in quite a bit of tax dollars, right? You know, over time, of course, you know, regulating cannabis as whatever it is, a Schedule 5 substance will bring in more tax dollars. But in the medium term, are they do the politicians in Washington feel like they have to fill the coffer of 280E with other tax dollars, or does that make sense?
I mean, it does make sense. And it's a really good question and certainly a hard one to answer. You know, if cannabis gets rescheduled as a 2 or remains a 1, which would be silly, but if it did remain a 1, 280 still sticks. But a 3, 4, or 5, as I mentioned, it wouldn't. And the industry would then be able to move into regular everyday business tax codes. So,
Sure.
every other industry does. It's just a really interesting nuance and frustration, clearly, for the cannabis, industry, in particular on 280E. That being said, I think that that's really probably a better question for elected officials to know where their heads are with regard to 280E and whether they would want it to stick, or if they come up with something else to replace 280E should cannabis get rescheduled as a 3, 4, or 5.
Okay, interesting. No, that's really interesting. So yeah, I mean, currently that's what I've been thinking. It's kind of anyone's guess. It doesn't seem like the writing's on the wall. I mean, at a surface level, someone in my position, investor in the space, I think, okay, hopefully they're not going to do 1 to 2. That just it doesn't seem like that makes sense for anybody on the private sector and the business of cannabis. Obviously, 280E is a huge concern, and classifying cannabis the right way is also very important. But financially and economically, like you said, 280E is just it's just this big thorn you can't get out of any plant touching cannabis business's side. So of course, everybody is greatly anticipating what that looks like. Awesome, Mara. Well, let me ask you just one more question here as we wrap up. So you and I were talking prior to the podcast, right? And one thing investors ask us at Key a lot is, okay, we all agree, right? Investors will say that we're going in the right direction. The train doesn't feel like it's going to pull a 180. We're making progress, even in little bits. Things are moving in the right way, how you'd want them to, but it feels like it's going in slow motion at the current point in time, right? I think you have a lot of investors even from 5, 6 years ago who felt like we were right around the corner then, and then now we have investors like me today who feel like we're right around the corner today. How do you think about timing with all this? And I mean, descheduling, potential safe banking passing, and then lastly, I would say just regulatory progress for cannabis prior to maybe the next presidential election?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you a tough question, and I'll answer the best I can. It's hard to know at this point with less than 2 months into the new congressional session. I do believe that we have some interesting regulatory matters that will make inroads for the industry this year. Certainly lots of eyes are on several different cannabis bills in the immediate for veterans, because that's what we've seen be introduced, along with potential rescheduling by the administration. We have to walk before we run here. So, for investors or anybody, certainly listening, if you want to set yourself up for, long-term gains from, investing in cannabis, I would say your best bet is to look at a multi-state operator. And so while, we can't list on major US exchanges yet, those are the types of companies that will probably be more likely to be primed and ready for their shares to take off when that is possible.
Sure.
which will likely most happen when there is federal legalization. So I don't know if that was a good enough answer, but
No,
it's the
that's great.
best one I can come up with at this point, knowing that there's certainly, progress to be made. There is definitely a lot of uncertainty out there. We
Right.
do have, a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. So there's some very interesting dynamics that come into play as well. But I
Right.
think, lots of eyes and ears, and, it's a bipartisan issue. And, I'm hopeful with regard to especially that poll that just came out and more data coming out constantly and showing all of the positive uses for cannabis, medicinally or otherwise.
Right.
And so, at this point, I think that, we just keep our ear to the ground and keep, working to put one foot forward and walk before we run.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's kind of my attitude as well. I'd say is just keep pushing along and stay conservative with your cash and how you think about your business. If you're a plant touching company, don't make any assumptions, right? That 280 is going to be gone in any period of time. And as with anything, investing, politics, whatever, timing is always the hardest, right? It's even the best investors can't figure that out. It's just out of your control. So will be interesting to see too, what they do as it relates to interstate commerce and how some of those other federal regs work out. But like you said, let's walk before we run. So yes. Well, Mara, hey, thank you very much for coming down to the show. This has been great to have you, especially after safe banking did not end up passing. And so will be, I think, great for all of our listeners to hear the latest from Washington as it relates to cannabis and know that there is hope out there and we are still moving on ahead here. So thanks again, Mara.
Thank you.